Welcome back to Centered. We are officially in our last week, if you can believe it, week 7. Again, I'm Zach Bilo, Director of Spiritual Formation at One Life Church, and we're so glad you've hung with us this long. And today we're going to explore our last question. But before we get into that, just a couple of quick review things. Again, Centered is all about the Christ-centered worldview, and our working definition of worldview, as always, is your worldview is your answers to the most important and meaningful questions of life. We all have those answers to those questions, whether we realize we have a worldview or not. And then, for the last time, but hopefully it's burned into your memory forever, our grid. This is a way that even from now on, as you leave and you are out in culture and you're hearing claims popping up from different areas, it's a way that you can filter through claims and compare them side by side, even as you go. As it gets burned into your memory, you'll even start to see and pick these things out in movies, songs, all of it. You'll just see how many claims and reasons and implications there are throughout the world. But quickly, our grid. The first thing when we're approaching a worldview, we look at the claims. How do they answer the question before us? Then from there, we move on to the reasons. What's the evidence? What reasons do they have for believing those claims? And then because worldviews aren't just thoughts that we have, but there's implications into all areas of life, we move to implications, which ask the question, if this is true, then this. And finally, we actually live out our worldviews. Again, it's not just something housed in our mind. There's not just a set of things we ascribe to, but it's actually lived out in our bodies and in the world. And so those are the 4 things of the grid. I hope that can actually be a really good resource for you moving forward. But today, we are going to explore our final question, and the question is there hope? And this recording is happening at the very end of 2020, and depending on when you're watching this, you may know the future more than I do right now, but 2020 has been one of the harder years in a while, just between so many different things, already compounded by some racial relation issues, just a million different things that all was housed within COVID-19. And just now at the end of 2020, this week actually, some vaccines have been sent out for the first time. And after a very hard year where a lot of people have struggled, people are hesitantly maybe having a little hope. And so this question, is there hope, is very real. And so, like always, we want to go first and foremost to a film that our creative arts team has created for this topic, and explore that. And as you watch, feel free to, again, in your participant guide, to jot down, what moved you, questions you have, doubts that have crept in, those kind of things. Just jot down your thoughts as you watch this film.
Life can be bright, beautiful, fun, and amazing. But there's a cloud that hangs over everything: death. Each day, for any of us, death is always possible. Even worse for all of us, death is inevitable. Scientists tell us that the universe itself has a shelf life. The expiration date is millions and millions of years away, but still, just like our lives, it's just a matter of time. All our bright, beautiful, fun experiences, memories, hopes, dreams, interests, relationships, loves, and hates will simply end. Yeah, that's pretty depressing. Are there any answers? Is there hope? As with all the other big questions of life, different worldviews give radically different answers. A naturalistic, secular, all of reality is physical worldview would say bluntly, no, there is no hope, but thanks for playing. Eastern pantheistic views are more hopeful and more complex. All of reality is spiritual and therefore indestructible. But that spiritual essence is one impersonal thing. This means no individual human being survives death. The one universal soul survives, so there is immortality of the soul, but not personal and individual immortality, where you remain you. The matter of hope for the universe and hope for ourselves as individuals is where the Christ-centered worldview truly shines. It claims that through one single event, death, the enemy of life, no longer has the final word. That one single act was the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth from the dead. And before anyone dismisses the idea as a nice-sounding but unrealistic religious sentiment, it's good to take some things into consideration. New Testament scholars and historians are confident they have discovered the earliest known statement of Christian belief on record. In the Apostle Paul's letter to the Church of Corinth, Paul references what scholars would have concluded as a creedal statement that would have been formed and recited within no more than 2 or 3 years of Jesus' life. Paul writes, "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time." This statement is significant for the question of hope in a few crucial ways. 1, it demonstrates that the resurrection was central to the Christian message from the very start. In other words, it wasn't a myth that developed over time. 2, it shows that early Christians, who were nearly all Jewish, believed Jesus' resurrection was a fulfillment of the Scriptures they loved and had built their lives on for centuries. Their willingness to adjust their lives, beliefs, and practices to the new reality Jesus inaugurated is a remarkable fact all by itself. 3, it gives to all of us something that is very important for the question of hope. Evidence. Historical, real-life evidence. The same kind of evidence that teaches us Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon or George Washington crossed the Delaware. In this creed, they affirm the resurrection had eyewitnesses. They didn't proclaim that Jesus was a spiritual leader whose body was dead but whose spirit was alive. A claim like that was common, and it's common now. They claimed something more radical and more significant. Jesus truly died. His body was buried in a tomb and rose again 3 days later. Literally, physically, historically. And he is still alive, never to die again. This was the flame that lit the fuse of the greatest movement the world has ever seen. It changed everything. Most of all, it meant that death, the undefeatable enemy of us all, had been defeated. Is there anything in life more worth conquering than death? Think of all the heartache and tragedy, grief and hopelessness so many have suffered at death's hands. Death is rightly called the enemy. It's an invader, a distortion, an alien injected into God's good system that turns beauty to ashes and dancing to mourning. To understand the singular importance of the resurrection, it's vital to know that it was a kind of inauguration. It was a beginning point, a taste of what's coming. We can think of it as a kind of down payment guaranteeing a greater future. It's remarkable and miraculous that Jesus rose again from the dead. But according to the Christ-centered worldview, it doesn't stop there. Jesus is called the pattern of what is coming, a reversal, a restoration, an undoing of all the damage death has done. Like in the case of the predicted death of the universe, it still may be a long time into the future, but it's just a matter of time. The first and most important move has already happened. Everything is set in motion. We are waiting. It's just a matter of time until those who have placed their trust in the resurrected Christ will be healed, restored, and completely delivered from the effects and threats of death. Even though their bodies may be lifeless and placed in tombs just like his, they will be raised again, indestructible, immortal, literally, physically, historically. In the words of the writer and pastor Timothy Keller, the Christ-centered view of things is resurrection. Not a future that is just a consolation for the life we never had, but a restoration of the life you always wanted. This means that every horrible thing that ever happened will not only be undone and repaired, but will in some way make the eventual glory and joy even greater. Honestly, it sounds like a promise that is too good to be true, but That's what makes the physical, eyewitness resurrection story so important. It's not just trying to communicate a nice, inspirational idea. With solid, evidence-based terms, it is assuring us that death does not have the final word. It assures us that there absolutely is hope.
Well, we hope you enjoyed that film. Our Creative Arts team worked so hard on this series and did a great job creating those, and we hope you've enjoyed them. For now, we want to move straight into our first stop on the grid, which is claims, because every worldview has a claim, an answer to what happens after death, and that is one of the big questions in life. Is there hope beyond death? And so in this section, we're just going to explore a few different worldviews like we've done each week, some that we've become familiar with, and we're going to explore their answer to that question. And so the first is naturalism. Again, this is the claim that all reality is simply natural, atoms, molecules, chemicals, all that. There's nothing supernatural. And so to sum up the claim of naturalism, we're going to put up a quote from Bertrand Russell, who's a Nobel Prize-winning philosopher and mathematician, and he sums up the claims of naturalism this way. He says that man is the product of causes which he had no provision of the end they were achieving, that his origin, his growth, his hopes, his fears, his loves, and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms, that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave, that all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievements must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. Well, I think that if you see that quote and you look at that, you can pretty clearly make out what naturalism's answer to the question, is there hope, is. Ultimately, that is a very clear no. Our hope is in nothing more than the death of the universe. Okay, what about pantheism, or New Age spirituality is what it's sometimes called, which is the claim that all of reality is ultimately divine. It all makes up the divine one, impersonal divine energy. So when we look at pantheism, as we saw in the video earlier, there is sort of an inkling of hope beyond death, but it's vastly different than the Christ-centered worldview. And so just if you can, just for a second, just take in your notes and jot down what you think the difference is between hope beyond death in the Eastern pantheistic worldview and the Christ-centered worldview. So you may all have a variety of different answers, and there's a number of differences that can be pointed out. But the biggest difference is that in the pantheistic worldview, at the end, at death, even though there is this inkling of hope, we no longer have any sense of self. All of that is sort of lost in death. We all sort of return to a impersonal energy that is the universe, that is God. Whereas in the Christ-centered worldview, we retain ourself and we are in relationship with a loving and personal God. So when it comes to the Christ-centered worldview, it claims that there is real hope in both life and in death, and that hope is tied to an actual historical event that can be looked at, which is the resurrection of Jesus. So historians now believe that 1 Corinthians 15 is an early Christian creed and perhaps one of the very earliest, and they think it could be dated as early as 2 to 3 years after the death of Jesus. And so that puts it really close to the beginning of the church. And so we're going to put that up here. It's 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, and I'm going to read that. 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8 says, "For what I received, I pass on to you as first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep." So looking at this text, two, I think, really good questions stand out. One is, how does the creed from 1 Corinthians 15 provide us with both claims and reasons? So look over that and process that a little bit. As you look, we're seeing multiple parts of the grid. We're seeing both claims and reasons. Where are we seeing those? And then the second question is, again, this is becoming a creed, which means it's being passed around to the churches at that time, and churches are adopting this as a sort of creedal statement. So why do you think Paul makes the point that some of the witnesses were still living at the time of his writing? How does that strengthen his claims? So now as we move on to our reasons, and we look at the evidence of the resurrection, when I look at the Christ-centered worldviews answered to the question of, is there hope? To me, the Christ-centered answer is by far the most beautiful of the answers. Unfortunately, just because a story is beautiful doesn't mean that it's true, right? We all know that. There's some really great stories out there that aren't true. And so the question is there any evidence that we can actually sort through and look through to see if the Christ-centered worldview is true? And the answer to that is a resounding yes. That's what we're going to spend a large chunk of our remaining time on. And to do that, rather than me talking and listing a bunch of reasons, we have a few other videos that we want to show you today to help you just get a good picture of the evidence that is out there when it comes to the historical reliability of the resurrection. And so we are very thankful for Dr. Craig at Reasonable Faith. Two of these are videos that his crew and his team have made up. And then one is another one that was made from One Life. But the first video that we want to watch, it's about 6 minutes long, and it's called "Did Jesus Really Rise from the Dead?" And again, there's some great stuff in here. We've left you plenty of space to jot down notes. You could jot down a few notes here and have some really good, solid evidence of the resurrection moving forward. So let's watch this and then we'll come back together.
Why was Jesus of Nazareth crucified? Because he made outrageous claims about himself. He claimed to be the one and only Son of God. Why would anyone take his claim seriously? Well, that all depends. If Jesus actually rose from the dead, then his claim to be God's unique Son carries considerable weight. On the other hand, if the resurrection never actually happened, then Jesus may be safely dismissed as just another interesting but tragic historical figure. Did Jesus rise from the dead? As we explore this question, we need to address two further questions. What are the facts that require explanation? And which explanation best accounts for these facts? There are three main facts that need to be explained: the discovery of Jesus' empty tomb, the appearances of Jesus alive after his death, and the disciples' belief that Jesus rose from the dead. Let's examine each of these. Fact number 1. The discovery that Jesus' tomb was empty is reported in no less than 6 independent sources. And some of these are among the earliest materials to be found in the New Testament. This is important because when an event is recorded by 2 or more unconnected sources, historians' confidence that the event actually happened increases. And the earlier these sources are dated, the higher their confidence. Moreover, the Gospels indicate that it was women who first discovered that Jesus' body was missing. This is likely historical because in that culture, a woman's testimony was considered next to worthless. A later legend or fabrication would have had men make this discovery. Our confidence in the empty tomb is further increased by the response of the Jewish authorities. When they heard the report that the tomb was found empty, they said that Jesus' followers had stolen his body, thereby admitting that Jesus' tomb was, in fact, empty. Most scholars, by far, hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements about the empty tomb. Fact number 2. The appearances of Jesus alive after his death. In one of the earliest letters in the New Testament, Paul provides a list of witnesses to Jesus' resurrection appearances. He appeared to Peter, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Finally, he appeared also to me. Furthermore, various resurrection appearances of Jesus are independently confirmed by the Gospel accounts. On the basis of Paul's testimony alone, virtually all historical scholars agree that various individuals and groups experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Fact number 3. The disciples' belief in the resurrection. After Jesus' crucifixion, his followers were devastated, demoralized, and hiding in fear for their lives. As Jews, they had no concept of a Messiah who would be executed by his enemies, much less come back to life. The only resurrection Jews believed in was a universal event on Judgment Day after the end of the world, not an individual event within history. Moreover, in Jewish law, Jesus' crucifixion as a criminal meant that he was literally under God's curse. Yet somehow, despite all of this, the disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. They were so completely convinced that, when threatened with death, not one of them recanted. Even the Pharisee Paul, who persecuted Christians, suddenly became a Christian himself, as did Jesus' skeptical younger brother, James. Some sort of powerful, transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement earliest Christianity was. That is why, as an historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. These 3 firmly established facts cry out for an adequate explanation. How do you make sense of them? Down through history, various naturalistic explanations have been offered to explain away these facts. The conspiracy hypothesis, the apparent death hypothesis, the hallucination hypothesis, and so on. All of these have been nearly universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. The simple fact is that there is just no plausible naturalistic explanation of these 3 facts. The explanation given by the original eyewitnesses is that God raised Jesus from the dead. If it's even possible that God exists, then that explanation cannot be ruled out. For a God who is able to create the entire universe, the odd resurrection would be child's play. An empty tomb, Jesus' appearances alive after his death, and a group of dejected followers suddenly transformed by a radical new belief in a risen Messiah. These are independently established historical facts. How do you explain them?
So one of the historical facts mentioned in that video was the disciples' belief, and their belief even to the point of death. And historian and New Testament scholar Dr. Gary Habermas actually said something similar that we want to put up so you can see. It says, virtually all scholars studying Jesus' resurrection, whether conservative, moderate, or liberal, acknowledge that Jesus' earliest followers were convinced not only that Jesus was raised from the dead, but also that he had appeared alive to many of them on several occasions. Further, scholars almost unanimously recognize that two former skeptics, James, the brother of Jesus, and Saul of Tarsus, who became Paul, became believers after they too were convinced that they had seen the risen Jesus. So what Dr. Habermas is saying there is this is not just Christian scholars that are trying to prove something that are saying this. This is the vast majority of all New Testament scholars, whether they are believers or not, have made this claim. And a few years ago, One Life created a video that addresses this very issue. So now we're going to go to the video evidence for the resurrection.
Paula Fredrickson, Boston University. I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. That's what they say, and then all the historical evidence we have afterwards attests to their conviction that that's what they saw. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I don't know what they saw. But I know that as a historian, they must have seen something. Is there any reason to believe that an extraordinary event like the resurrection actually happened? We might be encouraged to know that since the first Christians made the claim that the resurrection was Jesus' physical body coming to life and leaving an actual, literal tomb, as opposed to simply a spiritual belief that Jesus had come back again as a ghost or was alive in their hearts as a memory, it can be studied in the same way other historical events can be. Like Hannibal's invasion, complete with the elephants, Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, or the Broncos being crushed by the Seahawks in Super Bowl 48. Historical research is well respected, even though, unlike scientific research, you cannot place historical events under a microscope or contain them to a lab. Historians put reports together from written sources and eyewitnesses or anything else that was known from the time and place of the events to reach reasonable conclusions about what may have actually happened. While many pieces of evidence can be used to point to the reality of Jesus' resurrection, we will focus on three. Number 1, the early church exploded on the scene of the ancient world with the claim that Jesus had risen from the dead as their central proclamation. Many movements are gradual in building momentum, and when it comes to larger-than-life, legendary or miraculous characteristics claimed by these movements about their leaders, those ideas usually take decades and sometimes even centuries to develop. From what we know about Christianity, the claim that Jesus rose again from the dead was made from the very start, serving as this new religion's central idea. A passage that is thought to reflect the very earliest Christian belief, a founding Christian leader writes, "I want to remind you of the good news I proclaimed to you. Jesus died on the cross for our sins, was buried, and on the third day rose again from the dead." Within a very short time, this movement had taken the ancient world by storm, built on the testimony of those who claimed they had seen Jesus alive after death. There is every indication that they must have seen something. Number 2, the earliest followers of Jesus claimed to be eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection and went to their deaths proclaiming it. Now, we all know people die for their beliefs. That does not make their beliefs true. But one thing it does for all of them, it is a very strong indicator that they believed what they were saying. It's been said, liars make lousy martyrs. The early followers of Jesus claimed first to have seen Jesus die and rise again from the dead. Their deaths are an indication that they certainly believed they had. They must have seen something. Number 3, Jesus' resurrection was seen by his earliest followers and friends, but in addition, a very unusual thing happened around the same time. Two men who were self-described skeptics, even enemies of the idea of Jesus' divinity, turned from their skepticism to claim that they had seen the resurrected Jesus. The first was Jesus' own brother James. Historians are confident that we have good information regarding James, and we know he began as a skeptic over Jesus' claims to divinity. From what we know, he appears to have thought Jesus was decidedly not the Son of God, but also that his brother was a little on the kooky side, which, if you have a brother, you may be able to relate to. But somehow, James makes a complete turnaround in his view of Jesus, and the explanation he gives is the resurrected Jesus appeared to him. He must have seen something. Then there was a man named Saul of Tarsus. He not only did not believe in Jesus, but when the news about him began to travel, he believed this new movement was a dangerous and destructive idea. He took it upon himself to oppose believers, even violently. He had people killed and put in prison just for believing in the resurrection. Then suddenly, Saul does one of the most amazing 180s in the history of 180s. He goes from sworn enemy of the new faith to one of its most passionate and vocal promoters. What happened? According to him, the resurrected Jesus appeared to him. He went to his death, never backing off that claim. He must have seen something. Atheist New Testament scholar Jed Ludman. It must be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ.
Hope you enjoyed that video. That's actually one of my favorite videos that our creative team at One Life has ever done. It's so cool. Now we've gone to those two videos, you already have a pretty good list going of some of the reasons why it is reasonable to believe in the evidence or in the resurrection of Jesus. But we want to show you one more from Dr. Craig at Reasonable Faith and his team there that goes back to one of the major theories that have formed over the years to try to explain the empty tomb. So here's one more video. It's about 6 minutes long, and then we'll close out. But it's called "Did Jesus Really Rise from the Dead?" Part 2.
It's a matter of historical record that Jesus of Nazareth died and his body was placed in a tomb. It's also been firmly established that after his death and burial, his tomb was found empty. Various individuals and groups saw appearances of Jesus alive, and his disciples somehow became absolutely convinced that Jesus had risen from the dead. These are the historical facts. How do you explain them? Down through history, various naturalistic explanations have been offered to explain away these facts. Let's examine the 4 most popular ones. First, the conspiracy theory. According to this view, the disciples faked the resurrection. They stole Jesus' body from the tomb and then lied about seeing Jesus alive, thereby perpetrating the greatest hoax of all time. However, this theory faces overwhelming objections. It's hopelessly anachronistic. It looks at the disciples' situation through the rear-view mirror of Christian history, instead of from the standpoint of a first-century Jew. Jews had no concept of a Messiah who would be defeated and executed by Israel's enemies, much less rise from the dead. In Jewish thinking, the resurrection of the dead was a general event that takes place only after the end of the world and has no connection at all with the Messiah. The conspiracy theory also fails to address the disciples' obvious sincerity. People don't willingly die for something they know is not true. An honest reading of the New Testament makes it clear. These people sincerely believed the message they proclaimed and were willing to die for. For these and other reasons, no scholar defends the conspiracy theory today. A second attempt to explain the facts is the apparent death theory. Jesus didn't really die. He revived in the tomb, somehow escaped, and managed to convince his disciples he was risen from the dead. This theory also faces insurmountable obstacles. First, it's medically impossible. The Roman executioners were professionals. They knew what they were doing and made sure their victims were dead before taken down. Moreover, Jesus was tortured so extensively that even if he was taken down alive, he would have died in the sealed tomb. Second, this theory is wildly implausible. Seeing a half-dead man who crawled out of the tomb, desperately in need of bandaging and medical attention, would hardly have convinced the disciples that he was gloriously risen from the dead. As a result, no New Testament historians defend this theory today. A third explanation is the displaced body theory. Perhaps Joseph of Arimathea placed Jesus' body in his tomb temporarily because it was convenient. But later, he moved the corpse to a criminal's common graveyard. So, when the disciples visited the first tomb and found it empty, they concluded that Jesus must have risen from the dead. Once again, this theory cannot make sense of the facts. Jewish laws prohibited moving a corpse after it was interred, except to the family tomb. What's more, the criminal's graveyard was located close to the place of execution, so that burial there would not have been a problem. Also, once the disciples began to proclaim Jesus' resurrection, Joseph would have corrected their mistake. So, once again, no current scholars endorse this theory. Finally, the hallucination theory. The disciples didn't really see Jesus, but just imagined that he appeared before them. They were all hallucinating. This theory also faces considerable problems. First, Jesus appeared not just one time, but many times. Not just in one place, but in different places. Not just to one person, but to different persons. Not just to individuals, but to groups of people. And not just to believers, but to unbelievers as well. There is nothing in the psychological casebooks on hallucinations comparable to these resurrection appearances. Second, hallucinations of Jesus would have led the disciples to believe at most that Jesus had been transported to heaven, not risen from the dead, in contradiction to their Jewish beliefs. Moreover, in the ancient world, visions of the deceased were not evidence that the person was alive, but evidence that he was dead and had moved on to the afterworld. Finally, this theory doesn't even attempt to explain the empty tomb. Thus, the four most popular naturalistic theories fail to explain the historical facts. Where does that leave us? Another possibility is the explanation given by the original eyewitnesses that God raised Jesus from the dead. Unlike the other theories, this makes perfect sense of the empty tomb, the appearances of Jesus alive, and the disciples' willingness to die for their belief. But is this explanation plausible? After all, it requires a miracle, a supernatural act of God. Think about it. If it's even possible that God exists, then miracles are possible. And this explanation cannot be ruled out. And surely it's possible that God exists. So how do you explain the resurrection?
So now that we have a pretty good sample of the evidence, there's so much more you can explore, and we'll have some of that in additional resources. But now that we have just at least touched the surface of why it is reasonable to believe in the resurrection of Jesus, we want to move to the implications. Because remember, beliefs don't live in isolation. They inform all the areas of our lives and our actions. And so when we think of implication, we think of if, then. And Dr. Kretz said it really, really well in one of the earlier videos. He said, if Jesus actually rose from the dead, then his claims to be God, God's unique son, carries considerable weight. If it never actually happened, then Jesus can be safely dismissed as just another interesting but tragic historical figure. Apologist Michael Licona said it even stronger. He says that if Jesus rose from the dead, then Christianity is true, period. And even in the first century, Paul, again, he's one of the two that were skeptics that became believers. He wrote in 1 Corinthians 15, 12 through 14, if it is preached that Christ has been raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there's no resurrection of the dead? If there's no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is our faith. So even there, Paul is saying that this all hinges on this historical event that is the resurrection of Jesus. And he obviously believes it to be true. And he says that if it's not, then our preaching is useless, and so is our faith. So let's assume for a moment that you've looked at the evidence, and there is enough of you to make you think that it is reasonable that Jesus really did rise from the dead. So let's take that thought and let's move it into the implications of how we view ourselves and how we live. And so just for a moment, you can pause it here and just write down a few implications of what that means in our lives. What does it mean, going back to last week when we talked about the cure? What does it mean if this is true when it comes to the way we deal with our guilt, the way we deal with shame, the way that we can live fully? All of that stuff we need to process. We can't just leave our beliefs at just these statements that we sort of ascribe to. We have to move them into the areas of our life, and because that's where we can actually live with the freedom that our beliefs allow. And so, just for a few minutes, just try to think of what that means as you process through your life, as you process through your past, and think, how can I move on from this or that? What are the implications of the message of Christ if it's real? And so, finally, we want to for the last time, touch on actions, because beliefs are not confined to our thoughts, but they are lived out. So if Jesus really did rise from the dead, proving to be God, how would that affect the way we live? And if you're in groups, you guys can discuss that together. Think of come up with 5 ways of how it should affect the way we live. And this is not necessarily even a list of things like, oh, we should be a better person. This is more let's just walk into the freedom that we have. Let's list out the things, the way that we approach our lives that can be different because the message of Christ is true. Those are the type of implications and actions we want to live out. We hope you have enjoyed the last 7 lessons that we've had here in our centered study. I know that for me, even researching and representing this content has strengthened my faith, encouraged my faith, and I really hope it's done the same. If you are looking for a next step, if this has sort of made you want to explore these topics more, then what I would encourage you to do is find some kind of Christ-centered community, some kind of Christian community that you can be a part of, even if that's a digital community, a virtual community, that you can sort of explore these topics more, that you can discuss. And we're going to put up, just 3 ways that we can help you. We can help you take that step. So, the first, you are welcome to join our One Life Anywhere community that's on Facebook. We would love to have you, and we can continue the conversation there. If you are wanting to be to sort of check out a Christian community in person, then you can reach out to us at info@onelifechurch.org, and we can help you get connected to a faith community or a pastor in your area. And finally, if after these 7 weeks you've decided that you want to take a step sort of over the line of belief and put your faith in Jesus, then again, please reach out to us at that same email address, info@onelifechurch.org, and we can talk through the next steps. So one final thing before we go, we would love it if for one last time you hit the message board at One Life Anywhere, the centered thread, and just tell us either what your favorite week was or something that really stood out to you, or we would love to hear how maybe this has either deepened your faith or helped you trust and follow Jesus more. But we would love to read through that and have that there. But we love this time. Hope it's been encouraging, and we appreciate you tuning in.